Okay, as I mentioned, welcome to our webinar, Saving for College. This is the second part of a two-session series. In our last session, we discussed paying for college and the nuances of the FAFSA and CSS profile forms. This session is going to focus more on how to start saving for your child's education. My name is Rachel Gustafson. I am a certified college planning specialist, and I'm going to be guiding you through our webinar today. So as I mentioned in our last session, we at Financial Investment Team are dedicated to providing financial education not only to our clients, but to the community. At the end of today's webinar, there's going to be a survey that pops up for you. Take just a moment to let us know what topics do you want to hear on in the future. We want to hear from you. There's a lot going on in our world right now, and being educated is a really great way to give yourself some peace of mind. So as I mentioned, we're going to focus today on how you can start saving for your child's education. We're going to cover some options you have and some things to keep in mind. So let's start with preparing now for higher education costs. Whether your child plans to attend vocational school, spend 4 years at a public or private college, or go beyond 4 years to earn a master's degree, preparing now for the cost of your child's education is a smart financial move. Many parents don't realize that the average 4-year cost of an in-state tuition, fees, room and board at a public 4-year college is approaching $90,000. That's right, $90,000. That doesn't include costs for books, personal expenses, transportation. So if college costs alarm you, you do need to keep in mind that people who learn more earn more. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, people with a bachelor's degree earn about 65% more on average than those with only a high school diploma. So you might want to consider the high cost of college as an investment into your child's future. To that end, I do have a poll question I'm going to pop up for you. How much progress have you made to reach your college funding goal? Give me just a second here. It should pop up on your screen. Maybe you're just starting out, maybe you're halfway there, maybe you're almost there. Okay, looks like 50% of us are halfway home and 50% of us are almost there. Regardless of where you are in your saving process, you will find today's webinar helpful. So let's get started. Last week, we talked about the 3 steps to college admission and financial aid. This week, we're going to focus on the 3 steps to funding college. So regardless of where you are in the college savings process, there are effective strategies that can help you succeed. So we're going to start by estimating the costs. If you have a goal to work towards, you can be more successful in reaching it. Second, we're going to review various college savings options that you can use when establishing a college fund. And finally, we're going to evaluate additional funding sources, some of which you may already be aware and some others that you might not have considered. So let's start with the current cost of a college education. The average cost of a public versus private university for school year 2018 to 2019 is shown on your screen. So public university, about $82,000 for 4 years. Private university, about $179,000 for 4 years. Looking at schools in Oregon, for example, the University of Oregon is $27,366 per year, and Lewis and Clark is $66,526 per year. So what do we need to consider when we're looking at costs? There are several things that you want to think about. First, you want to look at the current costs. What is the current cost for tuition? Room and board. Other expenses will vary based on the school that your child wants to attend and the number of years your child might be in school. Some programs require 1 or 2 years of education, where a bachelor's degree requires 4 or more years. Your child might decide to attend a private college, which is generally more expensive than a public college. The cost may also depend on whether the student attends in-state versus out-of-state. So that just is a starting spot, right? You might have younger children and not really have an idea of what this looks like. And in that case, I would recommend just looking at the averages between public and private. But when you have an idea of how much college costs now, you can estimate how much it might cost when your child is ready for college. The inflation rate that I generally use for college is 6 to 8%. It's much higher than our average, our normal inflation rate, which is closer to 3%. Another important factor is how much you expect to contribute. This is going to be your college savings goal. You may only want to pay for half. You may only want to pay for as much as you can. It might be all of it. So you really have to, this is a question that each family has to answer for themselves. And I always tell clients when I'm working through this with them is you really want to look at your retirement goal, because that's really important too. You know, when you're sitting on an airplane and the flight attendant is teaching you how to put on your oxygen mask, they teach you how to put it on yourself first and then your child. And that really speaks to retirement as well. You've got to take care of yourself before you can take care of the kiddos, right? Because if you don't make sure that retirement is funded and there for you when it's time, then your children may have to pick up that. And you're not going to be able to get loans for retirement where your children may be able to do that. So you really want to make sure that things like your retirement goals are being funded as well. And so usually I'll help with calculating out, okay, we know what you need for retirement. Now we know what your surplus is and what we could potentially put towards your students. And this is going to be about the gap that you're going to have by the time your kiddo goes to school. Finally, you need to consider your timeline, not just how many years you have available to accumulate funds, but also the span over which you will need funds for college. So most parents will shoot for 4 years, but you also have to think about, well, maybe my kiddo is going to get a master's. And maybe that's something that you let your child decide, and if they do that, then they're going to fund it. But just some questions that you want to be thinking about. Next, we're going to look at types of funding options that you do have to start saving. So before we jump into your college fund options, I'm going to ask one more poll question, and I'm going to pop it up on your screen here. Have you established a college fund? And if so, what type of fund have you established? Give us just another moment. Okay, funny enough, it looks like 100% of us have started at 529, the most popular option and one of the first that we're going to look at. So let's take a look. Section 529 is a state-sponsored or a college-sponsored program. It's designed to help families save for future education costs. The name of the program comes from the section of the IRS that enables states to establish these plans. It's really up to each state to decide whether it's going to offer a 529 plan and what that's going to look like. Most states offer at least one version of the plan, which we'll talk about the two types here in a second. Each 529 plan has its own rules, restrictions, and changes. Oregon, for example, has the Oregon Savings Plan, and it offers a tax credit of up to $300 for joint filers. It's really dependent on your income and how much you have contributed that year. I usually work with clients to determine which 529 is the best fit for them and their needs. There are some really fantastic plans in other states, and you don't have to choose the plan that's in your own state. So it's really important to compare performance and cost savings of other plans. This is something we can discuss in your college education planning session, but just a quick note there. So there are two types of 529 accounts. We don't see the prepaid tuition plan very often anymore, but they are still available. Families can lock in today's tuition rates for future tuition costs at an in-state public college. So participation is limited to state residents and college alumni, so you have to look at the state in which you live. Because distributions are treated as scholarships, prepaid tuition plans might reduce a family's eligibility for financial aid. So essentially what you're doing here is you're paying today's rates for your child to go to school. let's just use University of Oregon as an example. You pay their rates now. When your child is college age and goes to school, they can go there, and you've already funded it. The biggest problem here or issue that parents run into is you are essentially deciding where your child's going to go. And that can be a really hard decision to make when your children are young, for example. You don't know, is my kiddo going to want to go to U of O? Is that where the program that they're interested in is going to be? But on the flip side, I have worked with parents where they are alumni at a certain school, and if they're going to fund their child's school, that's where they want them to go, then that's what's going to happen. So you really, it's very personal and dependent on you and your situation and the options you want to give your child. Alternatively, college savings plans are individual investment type accounts, so like the college savings plan that Oregon has. It's similar to a 401k. College savings plans can be used for qualified education expenses, room and board, at any accredited school, which we'll talk about here shortly. They are far more popular than prepaid tuition plans, so we're going to go into more detail about how they work. So they have several advantages as well as limitations. Funds in a 529 plan accumulate tax deferred, as in the case with your 401k, for example, which means the money that you set aside in a 529 plan now, as well as any earnings, will be untaxed for as long as your money stays in the plan. Later, 529 plan withdrawals can be used for qualified education expenses tax-free. We're going to talk about that here in a moment, qualified education expenses. 529 plans have high lifetime contribution limits. So typically you can put a total of about 300,000, and you have to check within the state that you live, but 300,000 tends to be that limit. In addition, there are no income or age restrictions for donors. So there's not going to be a point at which you make too much money and you can't contribute. You can also maintain control over the disbursement of funds, and you manage how they will be used. In fact, if the original beneficiary of a 529 plan doesn't attend college or need the funds, then you can change the funds beneficiary to another family member. So if you have two kiddos, say John and Josh, John ends up getting a full ride scholarship, doesn't need his funds, you can change the beneficiary on his 529 to his brother. You could even change it to yourself if you decide that you want to go back to school. So you have some flexibility in the beneficiaries. Under special rules unique to 529 plans, you can make a lump sum gift to a 529 plan of up to 5 times the annual gift tax exclusion. So each year you can gift to anyone up to $15,000, and you don't pay tax on that, and it's not, you don't have a gift tax return. And in most cases, you're not going to pay gift tax because there is an annual or a lifetime limit exclusion. I think it's about $11 million. So I always tell parents, you know, it's hard to say how much you're going to be gifting over your lifetime, but if you don't anticipate gifting more than $11 million, then really this $15,000, you don't have to necessarily stick to it. But if you want to, you can do this 5-year lump sum gift where you can put in $75,000, and it's going to count for the next 5 years of that $15,000 gift exclusion each year. So you put it in for the 5 years, $75,000, let's just say, and then you won't gift to that 529 for 5 years. You're taking advantage of the next 5 years. So if you're in a situation where you had a large windfall or an inheritance and you know you want that to go towards your kiddo's education, this could be a great route to go. And that's individual gifts. So if you're married, then it would be $150,000 for joint gifts. And that's without triggering that gift tax. You do need to make a special election on your tax return, so just keep that in mind. One of the disadvantages of 529 plans is that you are limited to the investment portfolios offered by the plan. So it's very much like your 401k where you're going to have a menu of options. There's generally tends to be target date options, and what those look like is, let's say your kiddo is 1 year old, you've got 18 years to college. You can choose the target date fund for the 1-year-old, and what's going to happen is it's going to be pretty aggressive now, And as your kiddo gets closer to 18, it's going to get more conservative by feeding in more bonds and less stocks. If you have more questions on that, when we meet, we can talk more about that. Typically, the earnings portion of non-qualified withdrawals is subject to federal and state income taxes and a 10% income tax penalty. So just know that there are rules around what you take out and how the taxes work. And the goal really is to take out funds for college needs, but if something happens where you take out funds for not a college need and it's not a qualified expense, then you're looking at taxes on the earnings. What you've put in, your contributions won't be taxed in that way, just the earnings. So almost like a Roth IRA, if you think about it that way, my contributions aren't going to get taxed, but the earnings that I take out will. And again, that's if you use it for a non-qualified expense. There are some other advantages that we want to talk about. 529s do have professional management. Some states use their own investment personnel to manage the assets, and some will hire it out. So that's one piece. 529 plans offer a low entry cost, so you can start a 529 with maybe $25. So you can start it pretty low. You don't have to consistently be contributing to it. It could be something that you start and you contribute to as you can. You can even encourage family members to contribute to that plan as well. You can roll over your account to a different 529 plan once a year. And this is something that does happen. I do a lot of research every year around the 529 plans that are out there, and sometimes they will change investment managers. And at that point, it's not as great of a plan as it was the previous year. So really important to keep up to date on what's happening with your 529 and if it still continues to be the right fit for you. And if it doesn't, then you can roll it over to another state's 529. So what can a 529 plan pay for? Some examples on your screen here: tuition and fees, room and board, supplies, computer equipment, the usual things that are tied with college education. Something else that it can be used for, which is newer, is it can be used for K through 12 expenses. So up to $10,000 a year, there is a limit on it currently. And this is a recent change, so it could be changed at any time, but currently this is an option. And so if you have a kiddo that you decide you want to put into private school, this could be a way to help you do that. So a little more flexibility in 529s that weren't there before. So a quick note, something we talked about last week was expected family contribution. And so this is just an example of and a reminder of what that is. So when you fill out the FAFSA to determine financial aid, they are going to look at two pieces of your expected family contribution. What is expected from you, the parents, and there's that income piece, but also the assets piece. And then your student, what is expected of your student, the income and the assets. And what I want to point out here is a 529 is considered an asset of the parents. And so it's only going to be calculated at that 5.64% on the higher end. Remember, it was between about 2 and 5.64%. I usually will lean towards 5.64% just to be safe. But only 5.64% of the assets in your child's 529 are going to be counted for expected family contributions. So that's an important note to make. Another important note, grandparents. Assets held in the 529 account, nothing is going to be reported on the FAFSA. So it's not considered an asset of the parent or the student. It's an asset of the grandparent. However, withdrawals from a grandparent-owned 529 count towards income. And so if your kiddo takes out $20,000 for their first year of college from a grandparent's 529, the FAFSA is going to look at that as income. And so, and it's 50%, remember, because a child's income, a student's income is a much higher percentage that they're going to count. So I usually recommend, and the recommendations are here, waiting until the student's second semester of sophomore year, so waiting until the second year of school, later in the year, or to save in a parent-owned account. And so if you have grandparents that are really interested in contributing a large portion to your kiddos' college education, I do recommend doing some planning around it, because there are actually some other strategies that you can employ as well. Okay, so that was 529. Now we're going to move on to the Coverdell Education Savings Account, or ESA for short, and talk about the differences. Very similar to 529, contributions and earnings accumulate tax deferred. Withdrawals are free of federal income tax as long as the amount does not exceed the qualified education expenses of the eligible student. We'll talk about that here shortly. It can be used for higher education expenses, qualified expenses, including elementary and secondary school tuition, room and board. Another advantage is that you have much more investment flexibility with the Coverdell ESA than you do with the 529. So you can choose your own investments. You could go in and choose stocks, mutual funds, exchange traded funds. It's just the investment options are much more broad in an ESA than a 529, where you have that set menu that you have to choose from. Now, the one thing though is the contribution cap to an ESA is only $2,000, and that's per child under age 18. Once they reach age 18, you can't contribute anymore. And it depends on income. So depending on where your income is at, you might not be able to contribute. And so the income limits are $110,000 for a single person, or $220,000 for a married filing joint family. So if you exceed those amounts, you won't be able to contribute to an ESA. If an ESA has a balance at the time the recipient reaches age 30, so when your kiddo reaches 30 and there's still money in the ESA, and the money has not been rolled over to another family member, which you can do, then the money has to be withdrawn. It's distributed to your kiddo at that time, and the beneficiary will be taxed, your kiddo, on the remaining earnings and a 10% penalty because it wasn't used for college. So there's this 30-year limitation, I guess it's the 30-year age year limitation. So and we see it much more now that people are either waiting to start college or taking longer in college. And so 30 can actually come pretty quickly. So just be aware that all funds in an ESA have to be distributed by age 30 or rolled over to another family member. What is an eligible education institution? It's any accredited post-secondary school that is eligible for U.S. Department of Education student aid programs. So if the FAFSA covers it, then it's likely a school that is going to be eligible. So just keep that in mind. It includes colleges, universities, community colleges, certain technical schools. FAFSA.ed.gov has a complete list of the current schools, so you can search there if you're curious about which schools might be considered eligible for distributions from your 529. And there are schools that aren't included. I've had clients that have had their kiddos go to international schools that were not part of FAFSA.ed. And unfortunately, the funds that they took out of their 529 were not tax-free because they went to a school that was not deemed accredited. So it is something to keep in mind. And as you get closer to your child going to college, really having those conversations and double checking which schools they're interested in to see if this might pose a problem. So I often get questions around how distributions from 529 plans are taxed. Now, it would be nice and easy if I could just say, well, what you pay in tuition and room and board and college expenses, that's how much you take from the 529 for that year, tax-free. However, depending on any other assistance you are receiving, that might not be the case. And on the screen here, you have some examples of what might affect your adjusted qualified education expenses. So what your adjusted qualified expenses are is your qualified education expenses, anything that was deemed qualified, tuition, room and board, books, so on and so forth. And you're going to subtract out the tax-free educational assistance that you've received in that year. Here are some examples. Tax-free part of scholarships and fellowships. So if any part of that received was tax-free. Veterans educational assistance, Pell Grants, employer-provided educational assistance. So if your employer provides assistance, and any other non-taxable tax-free payments, other than gifts or inheritance, received as educational assistance. You need to subtract that out of your educational expenses for the year. And let's look at an example to help us concrete this in our minds. So here's our example. In 2002, Mary's parents opened a 529 account. Over the years, they contributed $18,000 to the account. So the total account balance was $27,000 when they took their first distribution for Mary. And that was in the summer of 2020. Mary enrolled in college and had $6,500 of qualified education expenses for that year. $6,500 is what she had to pay. She also had a partial tuition scholarship that was tax-free of $3,000. She took $3,600 out of her 529. So before Mary can determine the taxable part of her 529 distribution, she has to reduce her total qualified education expenses by any tax-free educational assistance. So I'm going to grab my highlighter here. So $6,500 was her total qualified education expenses. She had that tax-free educational scholarship, $3,000, that we're going to subtract out of her expenses. This gives her a $3,500 adjusted qualified education expense, or AQEE for short. This is the amount that she can take out of her 529 tax-free. So technically, she took out $3,600, so she's going to have to pay taxes on 100 of it, or a taxable portion of 100. So important to keep this in mind, that it may not be as easy as you think. What I paid is how much I can take out. There are some other factors that you need to take into consideration. One other note here. American Opportunity or Lifetime Learning Credits. So they can be claimed in the same year that you take a tax-free distribution from your 529 or your ESA, as long as the same expenses are not used for both benefits. That means that after the beneficiary reduces qualified education expenses right here by the tax-free educational assistance, you must further reduce by the expenses taken into account in determining your credit. And let's just use the American Opportunity Credit as an example. Let's assume the same facts right here, except Mary's parents also claimed that American Opportunity Credit of $2,000. Let's just say it was $2,000. And so how that credit works is they're going to cover 100% of the first $2,000 and 25% of the next $2,000. We're just going to say that they took $2,000. So you're going to have to further subtract $2,000 out of your adjusted qualified education expenses to determine what you can take out tax-free from your 529 ESA. So a little more complicated than we think. Just some things to keep in mind. Make sure you're working with a financial planner and a CPA that understand this and can help you do the calculations. It's also one of the reasons I recommend, if you can, waiting till closer to the end of the year to take your distribution from the 529. Not all families can do that, but if it's something that you can do, then you can be a lot closer to knowing how much you're allowed to take tax-free. And as a reminder, you're only getting that taxation on earnings. So if it's deemed that you can't take out as much as you thought you could, but you did take out that much, that taxation is only on earnings. Okay, I know I threw a lot of taxes at you. Let me know if you have questions. In our tax planning is very personal and really depends on you and your situation. So if you have specific tax questions, I encourage you to bring them when we get together. The next planning account that we're going to look at is the Roth IRA. It is a powerful retirement savings vehicle, but it can also be a powerful college savings vehicle. So let's talk about some of the advantages and limitations. Before we get into the details, I'm going to say when colleges determine need-based financial aid, so when you're filling out your FAFSA and they're looking at your expected family contribution, they're not going to look at your retirement accounts. So your 401k, your Roth IRA, it's not going to be considered an asset, which is a huge bonus. Saving in a Roth IRA should not affect the amount of financial aid your student receives. However, any withdrawals will count towards income for financial aid purposes, kind of similar to the grandparents 529 that I pointed out. So keep that in mind. You might want to wait until your child's second year of college to start withdrawing funds after January 1st of your child's second year of college. So because contributions to a Roth IRA are made on an after-tax basis, they can be withdrawn at any time for any purpose without incurring federal income tax liability or penalties. Another benefit is that withdrawals of Roth IRA earnings used for qualified higher education expenses avoid the 10% early distribution penalty that normally applies to people who are younger than 59 and a half. I do usually recommend, though, that if we're looking at parents and which one should be contributing to a Roth IRA, just to be on the safe side, I usually recommend having the older parent do that, the one that's going to be closer to 59 and a half. Because again, the government can change taxes at any time. This hasn't necessarily been changed in a very long time, if ever. But just to be on the safe side, that's usually a recommendation. You must have earned income from wages to contribute to a Roth IRA. So in 2020, income eligibility phase out started at 124,000 and ended at 139,000. So once you are a single filer and you make 139,000, you can't contribute to a Roth IRA. Married filing jointly, the phase out is 196,000, or starts at 196,000 and ends at 206,000. So at the point that you two make more than 206,000, you can no longer contribute to a Roth IRA. So just some limits to keep in mind. Your child can also contribute to his or her own Roth IRA as long as they have earned income. It could be from a part-time job. If you're a parent and you own a company, you could hire your children. IRS recommends 7 years old would be a reasonable age that you could hire your kiddo to teach them about your work, give them little jobs around the work. So something to keep in mind is your kiddo can also have one as long as they have earned income. One other thing I want to mention on that, Roth IRA distribution rules, the Roth IRA needs to have been held for 5 years. So if your kiddo establishes one, you really want to make sure that they've held the account for 5 years before you start drawing on it, because what you're aiming for when you start drawing on it is that you're not going to have that taxation. So keep that in mind as well. Okay, now we're going to talk about estimating education costs and types of education accounts. Now we just talked about that. Now we're going to move on to evaluating other funding sources. So we're going to talk about some planning strategies and some other ways that you can save outside of the 529, the Coverdell, and the Roth IRA. Taxable accounts. Now, many parents have a savings account for their kiddo, and that's one of the first places that you start saving and one of the most common. They are taxable accounts, so let's talk about what this looks like. Savings accounts, CDs, money market funds, stocks, bonds, mutual funds, and ETFs that are held in taxable accounts. So You want to keep in mind with these accounts that the gains within taxable accounts are taxed in the year they are earned, where your 529 is not going to be taxed until you start taking funds out, and it might be tax-free if it's for education expenses. Roth IRAs are not taxed at all. Thus, a 529 and a Roth IRA are actually better tax advantage savings for college. It's an ESA. But with taxable accounts, you're going to be paying taxes the year in which you have the gains. So just keep that in mind. Some other strategies that I want to go over that we don't talk about as much, but can be really great strategies. You really want to make sure that you talk to a planner before you decide to utilize one of these strategies. One thing I will say about annuities and life insurance is they are only as good as the company that has created them. So you really want a good, strong, stable company. And they are very complex. So you want one that's been built very well, and you want to know exactly what your fees are because they can get expensive. Annuities are great, or can be great, for people who are over 59 and a half, or will be 59 and a half or older when education costs are going to start getting incurred. So if you're going to be close to 59 and a half when your kiddo starts college, this might be a good option. They are exempt for financial aid purposes. So if you have an annuity and you've built up a good cash value in it, then it's not going to count against you for financial aid purposes. There are expenses and there are surrender penalties. So really important to keep that in mind, but potentially something that you might want to look at. The other is life insurance. There's, again, non-assessment and expected family contribution. It's tax deferred growth of earnings because you're building up that cash value. Low interest loans. So essentially when you start taking funds from the cash value that you're building up, you're taking a loan. And so it's a very low interest loan, but you're basically borrowing against yourself. And that's part of the reason it can be eligible for this tax deferred growth of earnings. Potential earnings of variable life insurance policies. So if you chose a life insurance plan and it's variable, then it is invested into usually indexes for growth. You have a forced systematic savings plan, which is your premium. So basically how this works is you set up a life insurance plan with a carrier, and it's going to be a whole life or universal life plan, and they are going to tell you what your premium is. And let's just say it's $100. So every month you need to pay $100, and that's going to go towards paying for the life insurance policy, as well as building up a cash value bucket within it that you can draw on in the future. And so what happens if you're not paying your premiums is you can go into default with the life insurance policy, and possibly it could lapse and then you don't have it anymore. So you're really kind of forcing yourself into doing these $100 or premium dollar payments. It's forcing you to pay them, because if you don't, then your policy lapses. So that's one piece if you're the type of person that needs that encouragement. The other nice piece about the life insurance policy is there's a death benefit associated with it. So the point behind it is that you're saving for college, and then something happens and you unexpectedly pass away. Well, the death benefit then goes to your beneficiary, and in many cases you will leave it to your family or your child, and that is how they can then pay for college if something happens to you. So it can be sort of a multifaceted planning strategy where not only are you creating this death benefit for your family, but you're also saving for college. There are, administrative, mortality, and commission fees do apply, so you've got to take those into consideration as well. But the big things here are that it's not going to count against you for expected family contribution, which is nice. So you're building this nice little bucket without hurting potential financial aid. You've got a death benefit that you're building, and it's something that's forcing you to be saving for your kiddos. So the other nice thing about these two strategies is you aren't forced to use it for college. So if your child doesn't go to college or gets a full ride scholarship and you don't need the funds, or whatever it may be, something changes and you don't need these funds for school anymore, well, then you can use them for your own retirement, or you can let them sit and grow as a legacy for your family. So some options definitely to consider, not right for everyone, but options that we discuss when we look at what education planning strategy is best for you. Quick note on the annuity. Annuities work kind of similar to a life insurance plan, but what you're doing is you're creating an income stream. Where with the life insurance plan, you're creating something where you can borrow from it as needed. With the annuity, you're creating an income stream for a future point. So you pay into it, and then at some point in the future, you turn on the income, and that's what you can use to pay for your college education. So two different types of strategies, one being the life insurance, which is a little more flexible in what you do, and the annuity being, I know I want an income stream and I want it at a certain age, and so there's that consistency. So before you decide how to invest the funds in your college savings program, there are several things that you need to keep in mind. So you need to understand your time horizon, and that is, how long until I need to start drawing funds from this account. You need to think about risk and reward and diversification. Generally, if you start saving for college when your child's really young, you have a longer time horizon. You can take a more aggressive approach to investing. The more time you have, the better you can ride out short-term ups and downs. So something to keep in mind. Understanding your personal tolerance for risk is really important too. You don't want to gamble with your child's education, but you also want to make sure that the investments that you choose, you're comfortable with them. Diversification is another fundamental principle that can really help you reduce your overall risk. As the old saying goes, you don't want to have all your eggs in one basket. So diversification helps by not having all your eggs in one basket. With the 529 plans, for example, they usually have those target date funds. So it's going to be a mix dependent on your child's age. So that can be an easy way to determine that. But if you're working with some of these other strategies or accounts, you really want to make sure that you've considered time horizon, risk and reward, and diversification. Okay, so as you can see, there is a lot that goes into deciding how to save for your child's education. There are also several nuances that I didn't cover today. They're situational. There really is a lot that goes into determining what's right for you, how much you need to be putting in, what types of accounts, what strategies. So having a financial planner that understands your personal situation is really, really important. I bring more of that. I'm a certified financial planner, so I know the facets of financial planning, but also that certified college planning specialist piece is really important too. How should you be saving for college? How does your income play into your options? What is the most tax effective route for you to go? So take advantage at the end of the day today. There's going to be a survey that pops up. Take advantage of scheduling the complimentary college planning session. I'm not charging anything for it. I was an educator for many years, so this is something that's near and dear to my heart. I really want parents to be prepared for college education and to do what they can to save, and do it in the most tax effective ways and the right ways for you. So I am going to open it up for questions.